This is our final installment of our series, The Storied Life. I'm your host, Bob Osborne. Throughout this series, I have referenced novels, biographies, memoirs, and of course, Bible stories, all in service of what we have been calling the storied life. The life we all live, but need to pay closer attention to. And while I've told a few stories from my own life, you're right if you think this series has been a bit bookish. Still, you've stuck with me to this point, so I don't think you've minded all that much. So what is it about books that make them such a source of fascination for so many of us? Perhaps books represent the idea that understanding and wisdom can be both collected and shared. A book is a way to remember, isn't it? To remember what is learned, to preserve what has been experienced. Which is why I think we still need books in our advanced technological age, more so than ever, to escape our collective forgetfulness, to help us pay attention to the details of what's going on right here, right now. We need books. And one way to think about the Christian scriptures, the Bible, is that it's a collection of books that tell us there are things we cannot afford to forget, which also points back to your own storied life. Because now that you know that you have a storied life, you must mind it and keep it, because it's the book of your life. Your story is meant to be understood. Your story is meant to be shared. In this last session, I want to present one last idea for us. I want us to consider a basic tension we live with. On the one hand, we're all looking for home, for rest, for resolution, for belonging. But on the other hand, we're looking for adventure. And maybe we could say we are all on the quest for the more we don't yet have. So there is home and there is adventure. What do we choose? There are times in my life I have felt pulled by competing impulses, and I think this is true for most of us. On the one hand, there is this need for security, for home. All of us carry this deep need for a place where we can belong and be at rest, and that is a very, very good thing, a necessary thing. But it's not quite enough for us, is it? Because we also crave adventure. We find ourselves compelled to move out into the world, to take risks, to experience the creative wildness of the world and leave our mark. So who of us hasn't dreamt of possibilities? Thinking of what could be different, what new things could come into being if we stepped out from behind the walls of our safe living. So if the choice is between home or adventure, the pull seems to be in two different directions, doesn't it? Now, this is Paul Tournier, Swiss doctor, a man of deep Christian faith, a prolific writer. He wrote about things that are most personal to us. He wrote about the meaning of our personhood. And this to me was his real gift, how he could put his finger on what was common to every human heart. The search for home, the kind of home you need, and the search for adventure, not someone else's adventure, but the adventure you were meant to take. I was in my late 30s and I had just returned from an overseas teaching stint in Africa. And after all that excitement, that adventure, I found myself at loose ends. And with this acute pain that I didn't belong anywhere. So on a midweek afternoon, I was kicking around a used bookstore, and that's when I first happened upon Tournier, because there in the dusty shelves I found A Place for You, written in 1966. I hadn't yet read anything by Tournier, so I opened to the front page and I found a conversation between the good doctor and a young student who was filled with a specific kind of anxiety. Tournier wrote, he was trying to look objectively at what was going on inside him and to understand it. And then, as if summing up his thoughts, he looked at me and said, Basically, I'm always looking for a place, for somewhere to be. In that moment, on that page, Tournier named what I was aching for, what I think I've always been in search of: a place to belong, in the most fundamental sense of that term, a place where who I am is accepted and appreciated. And this is one of the truest things about me. And now that I've said that, you know that it's true for you. One of the truest things about you is that you long for belonging, for security, for home. But then as I continued to live through those middle years of my life, I realized that my deepest and most profound personal need was not an either or. It wasn't home versus adventure. It was more nuanced than that. It was to find a home through the long adventure. Because as human persons, we are not only in search of home, we are also made for the journey, for the adventure of becoming. So a few years later, I picked up Tournier's 1965 book, The Adventure of Living. And here Tournier makes the case that in tension with our need for home and security, we also look for something new to break the deadly monotony of life, he says. In other words, says Tournier, if home is basic, so is adventure. Adventure doesn't just belong to those daring personalities among us. No, adventure is the discovery of life itself. It's whatever courageous thing you are meant to take on. It's the mysterious happenings of life that create meaning. You know, Tournier talks about how his then 14-year-old son broke his leg while skiing. And while Tournier and his wife were quite upset with the accident, their son wasn't. He said, "You know, I'm glad. My life was so normal and sheltered, but finally something has happened to me." Which reminds us that the worst thing that can happen in life is nothing at all. We aren't meant to hide from life. We're meant to live it. You know, just before he left the world, on the last night he had with his disciples, Jesus said that he was going away to prepare a home for them. His actual words: "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe, trust in God. Believe, trust also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also." And there you have it, a place for you, a place to be at rest, to belong, to be safe, a place to be home. But these weren't the only words that Jesus shared with his followers. He also said that he was sending them out into the world, sending them out into the wild world of danger, like lambs among wolves, he said. And if all that sounded too challenging, he said they didn't need to be afraid, because he promised he would be with them. His Spirit would live in them. But why not the direct route to home? Why not advance to go and collect your $200? Why the long route of all of that? I think it's because God actually thinks higher of us than we do of ourselves. He has bigger plans for our becoming. So Jesus said that while he was making a final home for us, we would have work to do. We would have an adventure to experience, lives to accomplish. We would have a storied life to live out. So it seems to me that we really can't rest at home until we go through the adventure. You remember Jacob, who we met earlier in this series. The story of Jacob begins at home, though he's not happy there. He's not at rest in himself. His life, his identity, everything is a struggle. So he leaves home. He actually runs away. And then he wanders for some time, until, through the course of time, something happens to Jacob, like Tournier's son and his broken leg. Something finally happens. Jacob does his wrestling with God, the wrestling he always needed to do. And only then is Jacob ready to go home, having gone through a profound transformation. The scholar Kenneth Bailey suggests that Jesus' most famous story, the story of the prodigal son, is his way of retelling the Jacob story. The son begins at home, but he doesn't see or value his home as he should. He just wants his father dead so he can have his money. You know the story. And then the prodigal launches into the world only to find that the world is a hateful place. And eventually, he comes home to find his father running up the road to embrace him. You know, the big story of the Bible is this home, away, home again structure. And it's in the in-between wandering phase, the away from home phase, where we truly learn what it means to be home and where we become, through grace, persons who can be at home, who can be at rest, who are able, through their own storied living, to know how good home really is. The poet T.S. Eliot said it this way: "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." One can imagine the prodigal coming home, looking around at what he had once despised, and saying to his father and to himself, "Home is so good. I never knew it before. But now, having lived through life, I know now just how good home is." There's one final piece I would like to add to the idea of home and adventure. At the risk of overusing my friends Lewis and Tolkien, I want to share a moment from The Lord of the Rings near the end of Book 4. Sam and Frodo have already come through some real hardship, through many dangers, toils, and snares, as the classic hymn Amazing Grace put it. So for now, they rest a bit. Sam begins to muse on the meaning of stories, especially about adventures. Here's what he says: "I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folk seem to have just landed in them. Usually, their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you, at least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same. I suppose now at the end of our series, we are better able to define what constitutes a good story. I think it's fair to say that the best stories aren't the easy ones. The best are those sorts of stories, well, says Sam, that we hunger for to see whether or not the characters will make it through, whether or not they are up for the challenge. So Sam notes that none of us want the difficult path. We just sort of land in such moments. And if we do land in such moments, we know we have to be courageous because that's the only way to get back home. We have to go through the challenge we've been given. Sam says he used to think that adventures were just life's way to make things exciting. But that's an adolescent way of looking at things. The grown-up truth is that there will be passages in our stories, in our lives, that will be really hard. Things we do not want to go through. But you go through them because of what we all hope for. Because we believe there is a reward if we stay the course. And you, dear listener, will stay the course. One day you will be at home, at rest. Sam asks, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. Frodo replies that he wonders too. And then it occurs to Sam how the tales of the past were mysteries to the characters who were in them, but how ultimately good they were. How those tales turned out so well. And that thought suddenly brightened Sam's mood. So he says, I wonder if we shall ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course, but I mean put into words, told by the fireside or read out of a great big book with red and black letters, years and years afterwards. And people will say, let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. And they'll say, yes, that's one of my favorite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad? Yes, my boy, the famousest of the hobbits, and that's saying a lot. And at this, Frodo laughs, this joyous thought coming to him that what they were part of was actually a very, very good story, even though right now it was hard. So he says, why, Sam, to hear you somehow makes me merry as if the story was already written. But you've left out one of the chief characters, Samwise the Stout-Hearted. I want to hear more about Sam, Dad. Why didn't they put in more of his talk, Dad? That's what I like. It makes me laugh. And Frodo wouldn't have got far without Sam, would he, Dad? Sam, hearing this, thought Frodo wasn't taking him seriously. Now, Mr. Frodo, said Sam, you shouldn't make fun. I was serious. So was I, said Frodo, and so I am. Tolkien makes this point that while Frodo was serious, he still laughed. And actually, that laughter had not been heard in those parts of Mordor for a long time. Laughter is the sign of hope, the expression of joy. Laughter is the way we see intuitively, deeply, that what we're part of is very, very good, and that the outcome doesn't all depend on us. And actually, the story is far better than we can tell right now. As always, we finish with a few questions. Perhaps there are a few takeaways here that you want to remember, or maybe a thought you would like to voice to a friend, and make sure you do that. That will help. Meanwhile, here are a few things to consider. First, are you able to recall a moment in your life when you felt most at home? There often comes a moment when the idea and the feeling of home suddenly dawns on us. It's usually after we have been away from home for a while. Well, see if you can recall such a moment. And then maybe this too. Is there an image of home that best represents to you the deep goodness of what you long for? See what you come up with. Secondly, how do you relate to the idea of adventure? On the one hand, as Sam notes, there is the excitement of it, but as he also recognizes, there are also the difficulties and the sufferings adventurers go through. Adventurers know their share of perils, so they have to persevere. So what are your thoughts about adventure? What are some different types of adventures that you have considered? What do you think adventures accomplish in us? And thirdly, then, if there is a tension between home and adventure, where do you think you are right now? What do you need most in this next season of life? That might be a more personal question, but it also might be an important question for you to consider at this time. And number 4, what big idea or ideas from this whole series has had the most stickiness for you? Maybe we could ask it this way. What has this series prompted you to consider or investigate? Or this, where do you want to go from here? My final thought. You perhaps have heard of Anne Frank, the young Jewish girl who, with her family, hid from the Nazis in a secret Amsterdam apartment during World War II. She's known to us now because of the diary she kept, the book that remained after her, as a testimony to her life, that she had lived and that her life was a genuine storied life, even though she lived her final years hemmed in by circumstance, we could say. On February 12th, 1944, she wrote this: "The sun is shining, the sky is deep blue, there's a magnificent breeze, and I'm longing, really longing for everything. Conversation, freedom, friends, being alone. I feel as if I were about to explode. I know crying would help, but I can't cry. I'm restless. I walk from one room to another, breathe through the crack in the window frame, feel my heart beating as if to say, fulfill my longing at last. I think spring is inside me. I feel spring awakening. I feel it in my entire body and soul. I'm in a state of utter confusion, don't know what to read, what to write, what to do. I only know that I am longing for something." You know, Anne was not yet 16 years of age when her life was taken from her, and yet she lived a richly storied life. Anne took notice of everything, every detail, remembering, weighing, valuing. I've read Anne's diary several times, but also other works on her life and legacy, and I sometimes wonder if Anne's diary isn't one of the seminal expressions of our time. This deep desire to live, to become, to enter more fully into the mystery of life. Perhaps our COVID times have heightened these feelings. So what will you do when the pandemic lifts? Where will you go? What story do you want told in your life? And with that, I sign off from this series. I would love to hear from you, but not before I bless you with this. May the God who writes such wonderful stories make of your storied life something beautiful, something rich and full and significant. May you find joy and laughter. And even through your periodic tears and in your regular times of waiting, may you never give up hope that your story, like the big story you are part of, will surely end well, gloriously well. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.